Okay, is Jason on?
Okay, great. Members, we are live on YouTube and officially recording. Tim, whenever you're ready to kick us off.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to call our meeting to order of the Manufacturing and Industry Committee. At this time, Lindsay, could you please call the roll?
Certainly. Members, if you can unmute and verbally state that you are here, that would be great. Jason Myers. I know we don't have Jason today. Mark him out. Tim Hardy.
Here.
Dr. Chow Wang.
Here.
Hi, Chow. Dan Chance.
Present.
Hey, Dan. Gray Stream. I don't see Gray here yet. Hunter Johnston.
Here.
Hey, Hunter. Margot Moss.
Present.
Hey, Margot. Mary Lee Orr.
Here.
Morris Johnson.
Here.
Nathan McBride.
I'm here.
Roman Hardy.
Fred Palmer on behalf of Roman.
Great to have you, Fred. Scott Anderson. I don't see Scott today. Takesha Collins, right?
Here.
Takesha. And Zen Saunders. Okay, Chairman, we do have a quorum of members today.
Lindsay, thank you very much. This time, I'd like to just welcome everyone to today's meeting. It's about that time that we start getting into the details of our work. And so I think the purpose of today's meeting is to look at our actions planned, especially as it relates to this particular committee, and see where they overlap, see where some of them might be converged, make sure at the end of the day, they're going to contribute toward reaching net zero, because that's the whole purpose of our gathering. And then to take a look at path forward, action items. Where do we go from here? How do they work? How do they affect this sector? And just to make sure there are no questions, they make sense, so they can be such that they're easily understood and they're going to get to the goal that we want, and they are doable. We want things that absolutely are doable. So with that, without my taking any more time, I will turn it over to, well, no, first, before we do that, I'd like to ask for a motion for approval of the minutes of our last meeting, if you've had a chance to review them. Is there a motion?
Motion to approve minutes.
I have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Second by, is that Mr. Shantz?
Sure, yes.
Are there objections? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. At this time, Lindsay, would you please give us an overview for the manufacturing and industry sector?
Absolutely, Tim. And I would just like to welcome Zen Saunders and Gray Stream, who just joined us.
Fantastic.
And I'll share my screen and just walk through a brief overview presentation. But as Tim mentioned, we'll spend most of the meeting today in a working session, thinking through some of the actions that you guys have received in manufacturing and industry. And as Tim briefed us all in the beginning to think about what comprehensive emission reduction really looks like in this sector. So just to start with some desired outcomes of this meeting, to frame where we're headed today, as I mentioned, discussing the action proposals received in this sector, bringing to the forefront some interesting ideas. You all, as our manufacturing and industry members, put forward some really great action items and comprehensive templates. So I'm really excited for all of us to dive into this discussion today. And as we move forward, the governor's office team, so Harry, Charles, and myself, we'll take point on refining and gap filling, organizing and improving actions as we move forward from here, but leaning on the expertise of you all as our committee members as we do this over the next couple of months. So our hope for the discussion today is just to start those conversations, to get us in a good place where we can lean on your collective perspective and experience and expertise as we begin that process and start putting together the emission reduction picture for our plan. So I'll just lead us through a brief table setting presentation, and then we'll kick off a discussion on action proposals. Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute is also on the call with me today, and we'll be leading you guys through the discussion, and she'll be capturing some notes so that we can send out just some follow-up ideas and any points that we need to move forward with. So I just wanted to circle back to something familiar as we're starting our discussion today in our planning process. We've made a lot of progress over the past few months, and just wanted to remind everyone that we're operating in this third and fourth step right now of our process. The role of you guys in our sector committees has been focused in this third step of identifying alternatives. So identifying alternative ways of reducing emissions through strategies and actions, what we've been working on the past few months at that more granular scale. And then in the fourth step of the process on forecasting consequences, that's where our advisory groups, if you all remember, we have 4 different advisory groups in this effort focused on law and policy, on finance and economics, on science, and then on equity, serving as those advisory lenses to the work that we're doing and the work that you guys are doing. So they've been focusing on that fourth step, on forecasting the consequences of higher level strategies against our fundamental objectives that we all developed in the beginning months of this effort. So I'll provide you guys with an update on where they are in that fourth step and where we are in this third step as committees. So honing in on the third step of just identifying alternatives, through the emission reduction action proposal process that we had that ended on April 30th, we received 171 action ideas in our proposal action template in those 2 months when we had the open call available for the public and for our members as well, which is really exciting. We received some really great ideas across the groups, and as you can see, about 30 to 40 actions received in each of our sectors, with over 60 in the power sector. And these numbers don't add up to 171 because we wanted to ensure there's a cross-disciplinary lens and a cross-disciplinary review in our actions. So many actions that you guys are looking at might have also been, or were also looked at by the power group and by the oil and gas group. So we just want to bring in some different perspectives to certain actions. So we might talk through some actions today that might be better suited for power or oil and gas, but want to make sure that you guys have awareness into what some of the other groups are looking at that might touch the manufacturing and industry sector. So that's where we are in the third step of just identifying alternatives, throwing all of these ideas out there, and then beginning to work on what fits for Louisiana. But as I mentioned, the advisory groups are working in the fourth step of our process right now, and they're doing 2 rounds of evaluation to provide that advisory lens to us in a very formal way through what we're calling consequence analysis. So there's a first round that they've been doing right now, actually, in the months of April through the end of May. And they've been doing this analysis at a very high level, taking the strategies that you guys worked on in your March meetings and utilizing some of those strategies to build out these big picture views of the future of Louisiana. If we take different scenarios to emission reduction. So what are different ways we can reduce our emissions as we're looking at this big picture view of Louisiana? So as I mentioned, this high level round is being done now and has just been finished. We've organized our strategy as those high level paths to emission reduction as they fit into about 5 portfolios. And I'll dive into that a little bit with you guys just to show you what the other groups have been up to. But the portfolios are just a way to organize those higher level strategies so we can get some clearer, bigger picture views of Louisiana's future. And then in the second round of evaluation, which will kick off in August through September, they're going to bring in the more granular actions that you all are developing now that we'll discuss today, and that our team in the governor's office will be revising and refining over the next couple of months. So that way, we're not only looking at that high-level picture of Louisiana, but also bringing in the granular actions. What are the specific action points of how we're going to reduce emissions? And so how they're doing this evaluation, this analysis, is through evaluating against our fundamental objectives. So this is what we worked on, if you all remember, in our first meeting and over the beginning couple months of this effort, defining what else matters to Louisiana as we reduce our emissions. So those other objectives alongside net greenhouse gas emission reduction were around quality of life, equity, economy, environment, resilience, and short and long-term success. So that's how the advisory groups are looking at the strategies now and then the actions as we move forward a little bit later on. So if we dive into this first round of analysis, as I mentioned, there are those bigger portfolios just that we grouped our strategies underneath. And so there were 5 portfolios that we set forth for the advisory groups to evaluate. So we created these intentionally hypothetical future scenarios of Louisiana if we just pursue these different ideas and these different strategies to the biggest extent possible that we could. So first we took a business as usual case. And what does a business as usual case bring us to in 2050? What would the future of Louisiana look like? And then we looked at these other 4 portfolios and just turned the dial all the way up on what would happen if we pursue zero carbon renewable energy to the greatest extent possible. Where would that land us in the future? And then again, with reduced energy demand, consumption, and waste, and then with carbon capture, use and storage, and then with natural sequestration and things. So trying to understand what is the potential impact of these hypothetical future Louisiana scenarios, again, to give us this big picture evaluation. Not that the task force would choose one of these. We know that the future of Louisiana is a combination of a lot of different strategies and actions to reduce our emissions. So we're not trying to pick one of these portfolios, but we're trying to understand the maximum benefits and limitations of different approaches to emission reduction, as well as its impacts on people, environment, and economy of Louisiana. So as we bring in the second round of evaluation, it will be more granular, focused on our actions as we move forward. So that's just a little insight into the advisory process right now, which has, as you can tell, operated at a little bit higher of a level than you all have in thinking through the specific actions in reducing emissions. So I just wanted to outline through this graphic how these 2 processes will come together moving forward, and then where do actions go from here. So I know it might be hard to envision the 171 actions we have today, and then the final climate plan that we'll produce in February of 2022. So we put together this diagram just to show where we're moving in the next couple of months. So starting on the left at the top, action proposals were submitted. We already reached that April 30th deadline. In the second graphic, we posted all of the proposals. In the third graphic, this is where we are today with sorting the proposals into our sectors and our themes, discussing with you all as our committee members. We have a task force meeting next Wednesday where we'll report out to the task force. So a lot of these first 4 steps have been completed or where we're going in the next week or so. But as we're looking all the way to the right of this diagram on organizing, combining, splitting, gap filling, and grouping into strategies, this is where our planning team will be taking point over the next couple of months to integrate the work of different committees and also some of our cross-sector and economy-wide actions so that we're creating a comprehensive picture of emission reduction in Louisiana. So we'll be doing a lot of that work internally, but showing our work to you all and the task force and how we'll get to this eventual action and strategies organized into portfolios at the bottom right. So we'll go through the second round of evaluation as we're moving to the bottom half of this diagram, where the advisory group review process will come together with the work that you guys are doing in the sector committees. And as you see in the plus or minus sign, we're going to create these portfolios with the actions incorporated underneath them, just so that advisory groups can evaluate actions against our fundamental objectives. So that's where we're going in the August to September timeframe. And then you all will come back together in September to revise actions based on feedback from the advisory groups. And then in these last two diagrams to the left at the bottom, the task force will then begin to analyze and understand the feedback from advisory groups and begin to make decisions about what does this final portfolio of actions look like for our Louisiana climate plan. So that's how we're going to get from today all the way through our February deadline. Just to frame that in terms of our meeting schedule, highlighted in the red boxes are the meeting that you guys have today. I guess now we're in June since we moved to this meeting around a few times, but the late May and early June sector meeting, and then you all come back together in September for a final meeting to revise your actions based on feedback from the advisory groups in their second round of analysis. And as you can see through this diagram, the task force will meet a few times over the summer, but as we move into the October and later fall months, the task force will have a lot of meetings to focus on making the decisions, using the work that you guys have done as our sector committees and that our advisory groups are doing in evaluation to start making decisions about what this plan looks like for Louisiana. So you all have done the heavy lifting so far in getting us to this point. So as we begin to move forward, as that line shows, our team in the governor's office will take the lead on refining actions and turning that into something that will look a little bit more like our climate plan moving forward. So that's the update on our process that I wanted to bring you all through. Before we move into talking specifically about the action proposals, are there any questions on the process, either the advisory group work or the committees? Okay, great. We'll jump into the action proposals then. So in our March meeting, we all discussed the different overarching strategies that could be those high-level pathways for reducing emissions in this sector. So we organized actions underneath these higher-level strategies just as a way to organize conversation and to think about some of the overarching themes and the overarching goals that we want emission reduction to look like in this sector. So we'll go by each of these strategies and talk about actions that are underneath them and actions that we received. And there were actions that you all put forth as committee members, that other committees put forward that related to manufacturing and industry, and also that members of the public put forward. So the ideas that we're going through now they're not recommendations from the governor's office. They're nothing that we have vetted or that we're asking you guys to endorse or to build consensus behind, but just want to have an open discussion today about how far these actions do get us, where can we build on them, where can we fill any gaps that we see or further refine and work through some of these actions. So that's where we'll focus discussion today. We just wanted to frame these overarching strategies as we go strategy by strategy through our actions. Taking a look at this first strategy on increasing heat, process, and power production efficiency of industrial facilities. So to kick us off, there were a lot of actions around reducing emissions through the efficiency in industrial facilities. So this first action was put forward by a member of the public on efficiencies in combined heat and power in district heating and cooling, as well as the integrated use of on-site solar and storage microgrids. The second action was also around industrial CHP-generated electrical power and understanding practices in the utility purchase of CHP. So a few actions focused around combined heat and power. And Mary Lee and Dr. Slough put forward an action on industrial flaring transition to energy recovery. And then there was another action that fit well in this group on IPTs, which we can dive into as we come back to this slide. But I think an overarching question here is, are these mechanisms sufficient to ensure efficiency in industrial facilities. We'll talk about electrification on the next couple of slides, but wanted to focus here as we're thinking through these process emissions, as we're on those chemically and physically transforming of materials into emissions. How can we reduce those emissions, and what are different mechanisms of making those more efficient? So we'll come back to this slide, but just wanted to frame what has been put forward here. Moving along to decarbonizing Louisiana through electrification. Chow proposed an action specific to forklift and man-lift electrification. And the last two actions here are a little bit more broadly focused on increasing electrification through solar and wind energy. The first one's focused on utilizing federal funds for decarbonizing Louisiana, and the second one is focused more on the use of solar and wind power over carbon capture in Louisiana, so we can think through what other opportunities for electrification might exist as we're thinking through manufacturing and industry facilities. On the flip side of that is thinking about how will we deploy renewables at scale? How do we ensure that electrification can be broadly used? Again, a few options of actions that fit well under this. Roman, Hardy, and maybe Fred can speak to this, had some great ideas on encouraging renewable power choice in Louisiana, and Takesha put forward an action on renewable energy power purchase agreements. So we can think about where to reduce those emissions through electrification, and then how to do that as well at scale. Looking at this next slide, a lot of great ideas on measuring an inventory and creating an inventory of carbon intensity for products and facilities. A few actions around creating an energy audit of industrial facilities. Margot put forward a proposal on an industry certification program with some great criteria underneath that of what a program could look like to incentivize emission reduction activities that we can dive into. Hunter put forward the idea of creating a state carbon intensity database to measure how industry is decarbonizing at the state level. Kind of similar to that idea, Bill Robertson from the Public Service Commission put forward an idea to rank facilities based on their electrical power usage and on their energy efficiency. So those ideas can go together. Transitioning a bit to monitoring, there were a few actions on increasing monitoring of methane with remote sensing. Nathan put forward an idea that kind of goes with that on leveraging technology to increase our ability to detect leaks. And then two more actions on just monitoring greenhouse gas fluxes with big data. And then the last action here is on just understanding the risk of industry on vulnerable communities, and considering the idea of putting forward an environmental justice policy that requires permits as facilities expand, that helps understand the risk and the carbon intensity impacts on nearby communities. So a lot of ideas around carbon intensity, and as we come back through, we can think about how these mechanisms fit together, where is further measuring and monitoring most needed to develop these programs and actions, and how can we make these types of programs effective if they are the right approach for industry. Thinking a little bit more about market mechanisms and financial incentives, a few actions were put forward around carbon pricing mechanisms, a few around a cap and trade program, many encouraging that we partner with a regional or a national or an international cap and trade program or other carbon pricing networks rather than having one at the state level. And also actions focused on permitting streamlining for decarbonization of projects, and then decarbonization tax incentives. Morris, it would be great to have you talk through some of those ideas, the 4 different tax incentive ideas that you guys had put forward. And then as we move down this page, there were a few other actions around restricting or reducing tax breaks to industry. So the carrot and the stick approach would be interesting to think from you guys when we come back through on these slides. What of these mechanisms could be really effective to encourage decarbonization of industry, whether through the carrot or the stick mechanisms. Just a few more strategies to go through here. We had a lot of ideas around increasing deployment of carbon capture technology and infrastructure. I remember this was a pretty big focus of the discussion back in March. So there were great ideas put forward on what progress might look like in developing out these technologies and infrastructures for CCUS. So we can come back to this slide and think about where there are common approaches or different approaches, what is most helpful with where industry is in this process. And we talked through this a little bit last week with the Oil and Gas Committee and DNR, but wanted to also put this in front of you guys since it was a big focus of the discussion in March. Alongside that, we also had a good discussion in that meeting on just understanding the transparency, feasibility, environmental integrity, and environmental justice components of CCUS. And there were a few actions that came forth on these different components of the strategy. So there was one put forward by Hunter on having a set of well-defined and comprehensive policies on public pore space by private entities that are seeking to inject carbon dioxide into pore space owned or controlled by state entities. Another action from Adam and Scott, who I don't think is on our call today, on how to incorporate and coordinate an environmental justice policy for CCS across regulatory agencies and divisions. And they had an interesting action focused on the whole life cycle from source to transport as we're thinking about CCUS. How do we incorporate those EJ components into it? The third one on here is by one of our members of the Science Advisory Group, who raised some great points on just ensuring that we can detect and don't unnecessarily create leaks through CCUS technology. So he proposes a project to hone in on and prevent leak detection in these projects, again, to ensure that we have environmental integrity. And then the last action is focused on setting core requirements for transparency, equity, and public safety in the consideration and construction of CCUS activities. So I'm curious from you guys as we come back to this slide, thinking through what are the components and where's the engagement possible to be had in moving forward some of these action ideas and ensuring these different components are incorporated into CCUS. And then we have our last slide, our last two strategies are focused on increasing the use of blue and green hydrogen and other alternative fuels. There were a few ideas put forward around just how to incentivize hydrogen. I know this is a pretty expensive tool right now, and big electrolyzers are in short supply, and it's very expensive. So beginning to think about what those incentives could look like to encourage and increase use of blue and green hydrogen. And Morris, you had a really interesting idea here around hydrogen income tax credits that we can come back to as well. And the last action put forward by Shell is thinking about the circular economy in terms of plastics. So just thinking about how do we reduce emissions through creating a plan to promote recycling of plastics and the circular economy through chemical recycling policies and tax incentives for recycled plastics and feedstocks. Just to revisit that idea, we can think about how that might fit into other chemical processes as well. So those are all of the actions that were submitted under the purview of manufacturing and industry. I know it's a lot of actions, so we can go back slide by slide and begin to think about just some different ideas that can enhance and build on what has been put forward here, and just see what you guys think are interesting ideas or potential action items that could move forward. And I'd also be interested to hear from you guys on any actions that you put forward and can further expound on that for the committee as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to our chair. Tim, if you want to provide us any introduction and tee up our conversation.
Absolutely. First, Lindsay, let me just say that was outstanding. I think the proposed actions cover a lot of ground. And I do want to go back a little bit. We talked about some of the things that probably will have to be done at the agency level as well, especially for CCUS. But before we do that, let me just ask our group if there are any comments regarding the action items where we might dress some of them up, where we might coalesce some of them. Have we left any off? What are the comments I have from our committee members? Not everyone at the same time.
Hey, Tim, it's Fred on behalf of Roman. Just first of all, echo Lindsay, great job in going through a lot of information very coherently and very helpful and grounding me and I hope others for the body of work that everybody contributed. Tim, I do think there's obviously some opportunity for grouping some of these together. I think the one that we're looking at now that kind of shows the high level 4 areas is very helpful, but within the following pages, obviously some that could be bundled together. And just a question off the top of my head, nothing seems to be really missing. I think there's a broad diversity of ideas there. And there are several that are, you can kind of see like from a heat index where maybe a lot of the initial interest is. But a lot of this is good fodder for, shorter term versus longer term policy as well.
I agree. Well said. Other comments? Well, in terms of an action item, and with your comment, Fred, I guess the question becomes, excuse me, how do we move forward? Lindsay, is in your view, we should have a chance because, first of all, let me just say the number of action items that we have included, I think is extremely comprehensive. And except for, it appears, power, we had more than anyone else. So I just want to again thank our committee members for such a comprehensive job. But in terms of going forward and the way we're going to scrutinize these and the way we're going to look at, as Fred said, short-term versus long-term, because some of these I think can be done more quickly than others. Lindsay, is there a recommendation on how we characterize these or the time frame in which we do it or the manner in which we do it?
That's a great point to make, Tim and Fred, and it would be helpful to think about what can help us really reach this 50% emission reduction goal by 2030. I think that's a helpful, more short-term goal to keep in mind. And then we have that 2030 to 2050 for the other 50% of emission reductions. But we do have to get to a 50% reduction in the next 8 years. So what are those different actions that we can take in getting there? I know some of the actions on this slide under efficiency and then also under renewables and electrification can be explored more in the short term. So it'd be great for you guys to have a conversation on that since you all are much more familiar with the industrial processes than I am. So if it's helpful, Tim, we can go slide by slide and think of our conversation in that way, or if there's another way that you'd like to handle that, we can.
Lindsay, I'd suggest we go ahead and go slide by slide so we won't miss anything.
Okay, great. So members, as we're looking back at this component of, as we just mentioned, some more near-term potential operations to increase efficiency of industrial facilities through heat, power, and process. I'm curious, Mary Lee or Dr. Lomnicki, if you could talk a little bit about your action here, and then if members, we can think more broadly if there are additional actions that might be missing from this category or different places we can work here.
Yes, hello, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. This is Slava Lomnicki. So let me just elaborate a little bit about this idea about the heat recovery from the flaring. And if you're living here in South Louisiana, we all seen the flaring, going everywhere. And it's just a lot of energy and emissions of carbon dioxide that's being put to waste. And the technology actually exists as of right now, and it's just a matter of implementation of the technology just to redirect the wastes that are going to the flare into the heat recovery system with a boiler or some sort of power generation turbine or something. So this is something that can be implemented relatively quickly and relatively fast, particularly the technology exists.
Thank you, Dr. Slavo.
And maybe I can also comment on one thing, going through all the slides, since I'm already talking. I think it was on the last slide, which was the plastic recycling idea. And I think also this is something that can be implemented relatively quickly. And it not only applies to the plastic recycling, but every kind of recycling, which unfortunately in Louisiana, we kind of lagging behind, comparing to other states. We don't have much of a recycling systems that goes to metal recycling, glass recycling, paper recycling, and all of these can actually save economically, in sense of currency savings, as well as energy saving, which translates to the limiting or decreasing carbon emissions.
Well, I guess my question is, what are the things we can incorporate to make it feasible for recycling? Because one of the frustrations I've had over the years is that it sometimes costs more to recycle than it is not to recycle. And then we also have the problem where we stockpile materials that have been set for recycling and it never happens. The third challenge is that sometimes there are permitting requirements for recycling that is a good thing, that you have to go through a long process even to be able to do it. There are a lot of cases, especially under RCRA, where for recycling, if you're not going back into the same system, that the materials become a waste and they have to be stored in certain ways. So I just wonder if many of you have had those experiences and frustrations where there are disincentives for recycling, and how can we maybe promote incentives for recycling?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to, and in many cases, the recycling is particularly when you're dealing with partially hazardous components of the recycling process, like we have batteries, and things like this. And this is much more complicated. I agree with you, because this is, regulated federally, and it's not that simple. But what I'm talking is even about the simple recycling. If there are, incentives for both industries and for just a regular household, for even, sorting the trash, the biggest problem right now for recycling is that for people, it's usually it's a disincentive to sort their trash because it costs more. Okay, right. You have to pay extra for that. So I would think, the creating a program that actually you don't have to pay more for it, or actually you get some incentive, or a lower cost of your waste collection if you sort your trash. And this, is the first step to the recycling process.
I agree, because we talk about recycling, there are the three arrows. The first of all, the gathering, then the putting the material, and then making a new product. And so we don't have that full circular process. And I don't know if it's tax incentives or whatever we need. So I could not agree more. Are there other comments on recycling?
So, what kind of recycling are we talking about? Is it liquid or solid? Or just in general, any type of recycle?
I was talking about the waste stream recycling, which would be a solid type recycling.
Okay. Yeah, I know if in general for recycling for a lot of small, medium-sized manufacturers that are struggling with this recycle is because they don't have enough of a quantity for people to, come to take it. Sometimes they have some kind of limit. They don't have that much. They're not interested. Like nobody will pick it up. So eventually they have to send to landfill. Those are the more reality for small, medium-sized manufacturers.
Right, I agree with you, and this is one of the things that it's a creating of a state incentive, like a organize some collection, for example, into a bigger locations, where you can have more of this transition to recycling process. But I generally believe that a lot of our problems with the carbon dioxide emission and is a recycling. If we can handle managing waste in a proper way, the problem would be much smaller.
Dr. Lomnicki, I think that relates well to this slide, thinking through efficiency as well. How do we make these processes more efficient? I know when it comes to industry, it's challenging to reduce those more process type emissions as we're talking about the chemical and physical transformation into materials, how that does produce emissions. So there's that component of electrification, but also the process emissions that don't quite work with electrification. So I'm curious from you guys if there are any other actions under thinking about this efficiency side. We can also move on to electrification, but just wanted to frame those kind of separate and distinct as we're thinking about emission reduction here, acknowledging that not everything can be electrified.
Well, typically with the increasing efficiency, the biggest barrier usually is the first step investment process, right? It usually requires some initial investment, and maybe that's why not always the industry looks favorably at it, because it impacts their bottom line. However, if you look at the long term, it has a benefit. The question is, how to incentivize this process that, they will be actually willing to do it earlier than later.
That's a great point. I'll move us on to this next slide, thinking about electrification. Dr. Chow, if you can expand on the action that you put forward a little bit here. And then on that other side of how do we deploy and enable renewables at scale as well is another important component that has to be considered as we think about electrification. So it would be great to hear from you, Fred, if you're knowledgeable about Roman's action on renewable power choice, and Takesha on the PPAs there too.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember this one was actually when we were having discussion, we're talking about the electrification. That remind me that Energy New Orleans had this, they call ETAC program. I believe it's called ETAC program. So they provide incentives for electrification, including trucks and forklift man lift. So specifically forklift and man lift because it's more related to the manufacturing sector. Right now, I think still common this forklift and man lift in the manufacturing facility right now. Still, you see more and more diesel or I think diesel type of equipment you will see more often. To make electrical ones, you generate less carbon and CO2, and also you can charge the equipment on a different electricity schedule, so you can avoid some electricity peak demands charge. So that's another thing. Usually when we go to assessment, we recommend we can look into if you do this, how you can manipulate your charging schedules. You can save some money on the demands and also your kilowatt hours. Yeah, that's why this is very specific. I know there is a program available right now, but I think we can expand on that maybe so it can benefit. It's not just New Orleans areas. Right now, I believe that program you have to be an energy user to be eligible to getting those incentives. So we can push more, maybe market more so people realize. I think right now, the issue for electrification is, I feel there should be more like awareness from the either worker or the owner's perspective. They need to be aware of this technology, and we want to save some money, but on the other hand, you want to also save the environment as well. So we want to increase the awareness level.
And it's great that that comes with incentives as well. Did you say that was a federal or state program?
That is Entergy, that's state program. That's
Okay.
Entergy New Orleans.
That's great. And do you see, Dr. Chow, that could be expanded statewide as a statewide program?
Yeah, I would think so, because I think right now, Entergy, for example, Entergy has their own program. They have another program called Entergy Solutions. So that one, they provide incentives to all kinds of facilities like manufacturer or commercial or residential. They provide incentives to LED light updates, occupancy sensor installation, compares high energy, more energy efficient boiler or hot water heater, those kind of equipment. They have very detailed specific incentives for each items. If people are interested, they need to look at it. But again, they have to be Entergy customer, and you have to contact them first. Once approved, then you can approach to the qualified contractor and getting the incentives and get the project done. So they have every year they have some certain amount of budget starting from usually from January to the December. That's like calendar year. So they serve, as whoever comes first, they serve it if they're eligible. But there is a $25,000 limit per Entergy account. So if you had 1 meter, 25,000 is the limit per year.
Okay.
That's for Entergy. So that works for, I believe it works for all Entergy customers.
Members, are there other areas under this category of electrification? That was a great component to bring to the front, Dr. Chow, and thanks for showing us about that electrification incentive program with Entergy. But where are there other places and components of this sector that could be electrified? Tim, I saw you come off mute if you had any ideas.
No, are there others?
Well, it's Fred, I'll speak on behalf of Roman and asking a corporate relations professional to be a subject matter expert on renewable power and electricity is going to assure the lights flicker and eventually go out. But Roman did ask for some help with this, and I was able to tap into some very talented people within the organization, within Shell, to help with that. And I think, the points just made by Dr. Chow are, point two, probably the biggest opportunity here is collaboration between utilities, Entergy and others, the manufacturing sector, Shell and others, this task force, because I think, obviously Entergy, Shell, others were doing things in the energy transition prior to COVID. Then you had COVID, then you have, the environment we're in today, and with the task force and its objectives. I think it's just a scale thing where a lot of things that companies, organizations have been doing at maybe smaller scale within their own walls now have a chance to be shared and leveraged and brought up to a much larger scale by doing some things that could make options and electrifying some of the manufacturing assets in the state as part of that overall emissions reduction target. It's not the only solution, but it's a big part of the solution. A lot of it comes down to economics and what that rate looks like behind the meter, because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, but we need to be able to find that balance of where you can develop that resource, bring it into the sector, and be able to afford bringing it into the sector. So a lot of this is I think, just collaboration, cooperation amongst the different sectors to take these kind of ideas and try to boil down, what could be done. Again, there are some things that could be done sooner, and there are other things that could be done later. But it's a big part. I know it's something we have a lot of interest in being able to meet our objectives on our manufacturing assets in the state.
Fred, this is Tim Hardy. My question to you is, there's always a question of initial investment, but since you're located in other states, are there lessons we can learn from what might be happening in other states that can help us here?
There probably are, although, there are also some things that other states could learn from us, quite honestly. And so it's really looking at, and I'm a big advocate of, between the task force and what the governor has launched here, between our history in conventional oil and gas and manufacturing, with the workforce, the resiliency, the culture, all the different attributes we have. Louisiana can be the example of what a energy transition, looks like. And it doesn't happen overnight, but, we've got to get past talking and into real options. And I think that's what this body of work is starting to do. In answer to your question, Tim, yeah, I'm sure there are. What those specific examples are, I'd have to go back to my people that deal in the electrics, power sector all the time, and get some examples of that. And I could provide that to Roman. But again, I don't think it's all what we learn from somebody else. I think there's part of the utility portfolio in the state that is very attractive, that, others would probably envy having some of those attributes as well. Texas is certainly trying to figure this out given their recent experiences.
I totally understand. I guess the point I just would also, you kind of said it, echo, is this is a national problem. This is a worldwide problem or challenge. And we have some things that are peculiar to Louisiana. And I'm just a firm believer in where we can learn some things from other states, other places, that will help us become a leader and can be a model. I'd just like to have a chance to do that. And with a company like yours and some of the other companies that have reach beyond Louisiana, we might be able to take advantage of some of those.
Yeah, I think, Tim, there's a big pull in the conversations I have with our GMs and plant managers and all is, this is an opportunity to create markets in Louisiana and not make something in Louisiana to go somewhere else. So if you're talking about, plastics, full cycle like plastics recycling, that's very important to our Norco complex. We actually have a pilot going on there now. But being able to bring some of that part of that industry that is done somewhere else and bring it to Louisiana, but also create things like low carbon fuel products in Louisiana that stay in this market or closer to home rather than going to somewhere else. That is kind of the win-win I think we're trying to look for.
Absolutely, Fred. Those are really great points to make. I think segue us well into thinking about how do we make this happen. You're absolutely right that we need to think of the practical action steps of how to make electrification possible in Louisiana. And a great point that you made initially, that collaboration among Entergy and other power production industries is really important to create that balance and that understanding among the different stakeholders. Where are there other areas of how we can make this possible? I know there were a few great actions put forward in this area, but I'm curious from you all how, on that question of how in the implementation. And Takesha, if you're with us, it would be great to hear about the action that you put forward.
Sure.
Under
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the mechanisms that, my members discussed, one of the methods of kind of bringing, increasing the usage of renewable power here in Louisiana is through the mechanism of power purchase agreements. And like Roman did, I definitely had to outsource some research on this, and I definitely reached out to LEUG and Catherine King, because my members identified this as being, a really great method of, industry kind of participating and helping, get these carbon reductions. But, this I think is more geared towards the power sector. And so I feel like, this particular proposal probably had less details than the other two I put together. But the idea of this is that there would be purchase agreements or arrangements between, power users and producers, so that the producers, they would design, implement, and, kind of operate renewable energy projects, and that agreement would be with a dedicated buyer. So, the fact that the buyer is no longer having to use fossil fuels to electrify their operations obviously would, reduce the carbon emissions. So again, like I kind of reached out to LEUG, but my understanding is that there are definitely already PPAs in operation. You can kind of find those very easily. There are some that have taken place here. But, from my discussions, with others and with the power folks, it definitely seems like there needs to be regulations kind of put into place to make this, a more readily available, widespread mechanism that is, that's easily implemented throughout the state. So obviously there would have to be buy-in from the Power Commission and just work on that, and that be regulations put in. But that this has been successfully implemented here, in smaller projects, but definitely throughout the country. So that this is one mechanism of which we could, really increase our renewable power usage.
Thanks, Takesha. That is pretty similar to the action that Roman had put forward from Shell on creating and helping renewable energy to be more readily available and widespread.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like a lot of these definitely had overlap. So I guess, smart minds, thought alike when we were doing this project, this exercise. But I feel like, for your folks, for you and Harry and the others, hopefully, if you kind of like meld some of these proposals together, hopefully you can get really well balanced, thought out proposals that pull together different aspects that you would need for really well-rounded, thought out potential actions that we can put into the state plan.
Absolutely. This is one that this is one area just in general that ties really well with the work of the Power Committee. I know they had a really robust conversation around this as well, and it's very integrated with the work they do, and probably a little more in the weeds on the power side, but wanted you guys to be aware of the ideas that were put forward here that have that tie over with the power group.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on these first two slides? And if not, we'll move on to this strategy of measuring and creating an inventory of carbon intensity of products and facilities. Many of you put forward actions in this category, so it'd be great to hear from Dr. Chow and Margot and Hunter and Nathan about the actions that you guys were thinking of in this sector.
Yeah, this one I kind of mentioned a little bit in last slide, and we recommend all the facility to go through a self-energy assessment. Just first of all, you want to have your own cooperative energy goal. Right? If you're a big program, you may think about have a sustainability program. I know some of the big manufacturers, they do have or plan to have a sustainability program, which will help, will be very helpful for this task force, you know. And also, I'm part of the Industrial Assessment Center at LSU. We do provide free assessments. So, I mean, our recommendation is, you know, use the available federal or state resources as much as possible. So I think from the state level, you know, we can not necessarily require, maybe, you know, highly recommend they have either getting assessment from the federal agency or just conduct a self-assessment. There's available technical documents from U.S. Department of Energy. There's all available resources. They can follow the step there. Just conduct a self-assessment to see where their energy profile locates, you know, what's their cooperative goals should be in the next 5 years or 10 years, so they can have a better understanding of their facility and a better strategy on the energy efficient or energy usage moving forward.
And you said that data is available currently?
Right. U.S. Department of Energy they have a lot of technical documents under Industrial Assessment Center. They do have a case book for, you know, like step by step, tell the manufacturer how to do a self-assessment. So, I mean, I can send you a link later on if you want to post it somewhere.
That'd be great.
So my proposal, I think, ties in well with Hunter's and Chow's as well in terms of determining real greenhouse gas reduction, but also creating a framework on the state level for certification and the benefits that could provide to industry if they decide to be in this program. And in the proposal, I discussed several benefits from it. There's the EPA STAR program. California and Texas have also implemented programs that are very similar and have shown both savings to industry as well as real reduction on a state level and national level. I think the advantage of this certification program is it ties in with the other sectors as well as the other action proposals, such as, you know, power purchasing agreements. Industry would get credit for dedicating resources to renewable energy, and that could go towards their overall reduction and help industry pick kind of their a la carte of what works best for them on a site level and compare them across different sectors.
Margo, would you say this is like the industry equivalent of LEED certification? If you know.
Yeah, it's kind of, with LEED, you can pick different, whether you want to insulate your building or upgrade your electricity, or it's kind of a similar idea. So whether you're, you know, a gravel mine or you're Norco, you're going to have very, very different requirements and abilities to influence your greenhouse gas emissions. So it allows just a range of different types of industry to compete on the same level. And then the way that I envision this moving forward is to, there's not only benefits to being in the program in terms of support from other industries and just, getting to say that you're in the program, but also some sort of government procurement advantage, such as we do with the Hudson and other small businesses, where you get kind of points to help offset those costs that you're absorbing to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions.
It's a really great approach to offer that nuance, since different facilities produce different products, they do different manufacturing processes, so it's great to bring in that nuance that makes it applicable for all of the different industries.
Yeah, hi, it's Hunter here. Margot, it sounds like you and I were channeling very closely sort of the same thought. There's different ways you can do this. I started with the certification program. I think that with some of the collaboration with some of the other members, I ended up with the database, but I agree with kind of the way that you describe it and some of the advantages that you mentioned. One of the ways I was thinking about this is just, Louisiana was the fourth largest carbon intensive state or carbon emissions. And a lot of the emissions are associated with energy intensive industries. We're talking about major production of chemicals and variety of different chemicals that are exported. And the ability, not just for the state, but for the individual companies to track their carbon intensity and of their products. And it will be very advantageous just in terms of marketing those products internationally. We've seen just in the news, some news of LNG projects trying to decarbonize through carbon capture in order to make those products more competitive from a greenhouse gas carbon intensity standpoint. Internationally, because that's what other countries are requiring. They want more less carbon intensive products. And so having a database, based on existing information that's required from the greenhouse gas reporting program, for instance, and just organizing it in a way that individual companies and individual industries can kind of measure baseline carbon intensity against future ambition, and Louisiana itself can track how it's meeting reduction in the industrial sector. Seems to me those would be very valuable tools to have for the state and for these industries, and really make it's a competitiveness issue, because it'll make Louisiana more competitive if it's able to decrease the carbon intensity of these high value products.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just something else, as I was, researching and thinking about this, when I reached out to some of my clients, a lot of the smaller industrial partners that I work with would love to do some of these, but for them, it is a cost issue. And I know, reading the news, a lot of larger industries are already moving towards some of these voluntary measures because it makes sense from a financial standpoint, and also just to be a good corporate citizen. But I really wanted to build in some sort of procurement or some sort of financial advantage to some of the smaller businesses and industries that operate in Louisiana, because we have a lot of those as well, to allow them to compete on an equal level. And my company is a small business, so I know that small business program well, and it works very well in a lot of other industries. So I thought we could incorporate that aspect of it as well. So it's not just, I'm familiar with the greenhouse gas for the EPA, they have to submit every year. But I thought that kind of coming at it from a more local small business, also having a group of other industry partners who could help support and share ideas would make it a community, as opposed to just, kind of throwing it out into the ether. So I think that would be an important factor in however we go about this, that I would like to see.
It's a great point to raise, Margot. What are those components that you think will make it more accessible for smaller industries?
So I would like to see it be nested under LDEQ. and how LDEQ has their small business program already, something similar to that, so that they can provide resources, training, advice, as well as some sort of group with information sharing. I think honestly, the government procurement is going to be a major part of that as well. A lot of the industry that's, small and medium sized. We have a lot of concrete facilities, gravel mines. There's some really interesting technology going on with sequestering carbon in gravel. Actually, it's a coating that can go around some of these gravel, and it can be used for roads. We have tons of infrastructure projects coming down the road. So a lot of those businesses would benefit from having a financial incentive to invest in some of these carbon sequestration technologies up front.
Thanks for explaining that, Margot. I think those are great mechanisms. And even with what Hunter mentioned, we had a few actions put forward, more focused in the building sector, but on creating a Buy Clean Louisiana policy and on clean product standards. I've seen that that's a really great way that many places and internationally, even as Hunter mentioned, have steps that they've taken in reducing emissions. We had one of our April climate workshops focused on procurement, but I do think this is a great area for us to be exploring and thinking through, Margot, and even incentivizing and making this more accessible for smaller industries. So I appreciate that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of technology out there, and I think if there's, I know also we have a lot of barges. There's a lot of cool technologies going on with some of the scrubbers. There's just it's a little bit outside of the price range. Just when I've spoke with people in the communities down here, for them to be doing right now, although they would very much like to.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And where we'll go next on the next strategy is thinking through those financial incentives for decarbonization. I think this will be another important component for us to think back through, incorporating smaller facilities in that too. So also on the measuring and inventorying of carbon intensity is just increasing our monitoring and measuring of methane was one of the actions, but on our carbon intensity as well. So where do you guys think that monitoring is most needed and would be most effective? Nathan, it'd be great to hear on your action put forward here. There were also a few by Dr. Alex Kolker, who's on our science advisory group, thinking through some similar ideas on that.
Yeah, so on the leak detection technology piece, so I had a couple things in mind on that specifically. One was, and I believe Lori alluded to this on the oil and gas and mining sector committee the other day, but really taking a look at how our regulations are crafted and how they take into account recent advances in technology, particularly in the areas of like I'm thinking optical gas imaging, like FLIR cameras that can get down to identifying with a pretty high degree of accuracy the constituents of what's within the viewing area, and also leveraging drone technology to basically, what I have in my mind of what happens now for companies to that they're going out to look for leaks down pipelines and through refineries by flying drones with a FLIR camera on them. So is there a way that we can look at how the regulations are, especially LDAR, leak detection and repair regulations are drafted to allow for some regulatory flexibility, that you might be able to go inspect more of your facility with a drone than you would with a manual sniffer-based LDAR program. So that's kind of what I was thinking there. The other piece of it would be to look at, and this isn't necessarily for this, maybe more on the upstream oil and gas and then the pipeline regime, but looking at how companies handle their leak detection and their monitoring regimes, and putting together and working among our members to put together kind of an industry best practice document that kind of is a way to share information among operators that really would focus on the unique aspects of operating both exploration and production and midstream facilities in Louisiana. So that's kind of the two pieces I see looking at from that recommendation that we had.
That's great, Nathan. Thank you. I'm curious if any other members have comments on that action or just more broadly thinking about monitoring.
I think it's essential. I thank you so much for talking about it. I think it's an important step in going forward.
Absolutely. And as Nathan mentioned, exploring too, just where the regulations stand now and where flexibility is in that. I know Tim's counterpart, Jason Myers from DEQ, our other co-chair, had to be in jury duty this week, but I'll be interested to get his perspective on that following this meeting.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, Lindsay. This is Zen. Sorry, I'll just jump in with an additional comment there. Yeah, I do think it's a really good proposition there, Nathan. And I will just add that that one doesn't take a lot of investment. And I know at the onset of the discussion, we talked about, you know, projects that will help us in the near future, getting us to 50 by 2030. This one is we can get to a lot sooner. So I just want to point that out.
Thanks, Zen. It's a great point.
Thank you. This is absolutely true. We can start now. It isn't something we have to think about or invent. There's technology out there that some industries do use, and it'd be wonderful if there was more collaboration about it.
And where we're moving to on this next slide is thinking, so we spent the past 30 minutes or so talking about different ways to decarbonize. So there were also a lot of great actions on how we make that happen. What are different financial incentives for decarbonization, different market mechanisms that can help drive demand in that direction, great actions put forward by all of you and some of our members on the oil and gas group as well. So I'm curious if anyone wants to talk through either their action or an interesting idea that they see on this slide.
Well, hi guys, this is Takesha. My action proposal was just, to support carbon pricing as an overall strategy, wherein you place a price on carbon and it incentivizes stakeholders to kind of move towards implementing lower emission technologies, to generate power. And I know that so my proposal was just to talk specifically about carbon pricing overall in general. I did not, for my proposal, actually delve in and try to talk about or choose, one mechanism over another as being, better. Because I have a whole bunch of members at LCA, and they all come from different perspectives, and they all have their own different ideas about which mechanisms would work for their own companies and which ones they think would have a better impact. So I kind of just talked about carbon pricing as an overall strategy, but we definitely support the idea of using a market-based approach to price carbon. And we were some of the ones that talked about preferring there be a national or international strategy versus just having a state only. Just with having different states with different, having each state do its own or having multiple, throughout the country, I think it's going to be really unwieldy, and it would lead to some disadvantages, potentially disadvantages for the state. So we definitely like the idea of there being at least a national approach to this. Now we, have heard the discussions where the Department of Environmental Quality has been talking about doing a regional approach, and I think Dr. Brown and his folks are kind of doing the their due diligence, and they're going to do the research or whatever. And so I kind of feel that they're doing that part. But we definitely think that at least a national strategy would just be the most effective way to put in a carbon pricing mechanism. But we do acknowledge, and we do see that carbon pricing has been successfully implemented, not only throughout this country, but internationally in dozens of countries, across the globe, and that depending, the different mechanisms can get you, vast amounts of reduction. And so, we definitely at LCA think this is a really worthwhile strategy to really delve into and potentially include into our final plan.
Thanks to Keisha for thinking through that with your partners and for putting forward that idea. Glenn Lyons from ExxonMobil had put together a similar idea on a broader carbon pricing framework, also recommending that we take that more national approach in putting a price on carbon. As you mentioned, expanding the market, because we see a lot of benefits when that is done regionally or nationally as well. So a few great ideas centered around that too. Morris, I see that you're on the call today. Would you mind walking us through a little bit of the two actions that you put forward with CF Industries on this slide?
Sure. So, just kind of broadly, I think it goes without saying that a significant barrier to investment in large-scale industrial decarbonization projects is a challenge, because the reality that the economic benefits of many of these projects may not materialize for many years after the assets are in place. This is particularly true for commodity products such as ammonia and steel, both of which are produced here in large quantities in Louisiana. They're sold on the basis of price, and the added cost of production of these decarbonized products can't be passed on to customers given the substantial competition overseas, particularly with countries such as China that have excess capacity in both of these products. So until production and infrastructure costs decline, demand development for these products, incentives such as, we had talked, I think we had put a couple down for tax incentives related to, taking full depreciation and year costs are incurred, kind of mirroring the ITEP program where you can take 100% exemption for projects, decarbonization projects on local property taxes for 10 years, sales tax, reduce or eliminate sales tax assessed on goods or services associated with decarbonization projects. And the other thing is, and I think we have it on here, on permit streamlining. Obviously, permit acquisition for such projects are uncertain, they're expensive and lengthy, which can be a significant barrier to investment. So in order to accelerate the development of these type of projects, anything that the state could do to reduce the delays and excessive costs associated with permitting such projects could help facilitate moving these projects forward. On the hydrogen specific one that we put, obviously, hydrogen, we believe, is essential to Louisiana's decarbonization efforts and meeting the net zero by 2050. One proposal would be, a credit on corporate income tax is equal to 10% of the cost of the investment of equipment and facilities to both decarbonize existing hydrogen production, produce decarbonized hydrogen, and or to store and transport decarbonized hydrogen or infrastructure investments. And again, this is to try to help facilitate, these very capital and operational projects going forward.
So this is Nathan McBride. I'll say more so that we definitely are of similar mindset on several of these. I know in particular we had some conversation with some legislators this session. Unfortunately, we weren't really able to move it because of the implications of some with the COVID tax relief benefits and how that is associated with credits and things. So we weren't able to work it this year, but we were looking at bringing back a green industries jobs tax credit is what I believe the program was called, that sunset in 2017, that I think would fall right in line with this hydrogen investment piece that you're discussing. So I'd love to talk about that more in the future, and that's something we want to continue advocating for. And also along the lines of your permitting streamlining piece, I know that kind of fits in line. I think it's on the next slide, but where I mentioned it, I think the title of it is basically encourage adoption of CCUS, but that's part of it, is working hand in hand with DNR and continuing that working relationship to work through the permitting process. And I know there's some lingering regulatory and statutory potential roadblocks for sequestration projects that we still need to work through, that I want to continue working with companies such as yours and with DNR to get through those challenges. And I guess building on that, we also are looking at some kind of property tax exemption or maybe a discounted assessment or assessing at scrap value, something like that, for equipment that reduces greenhouse gases, but that doesn't necessarily bring a positive return on investment. So I'm thinking here would be the capture equipment and maybe some CO2 pipeline infrastructure, and even up to the Class 6 well facility. If there's not necessarily a positive return on investment, that the state would come alongside these companies that are making these investments in reducing greenhouse gases, that would help these projects pencil out from a property tax perspective.
And Nathan, you said in your action that would require a statutory amendment. Is that right?
If we were to do a full-on exemption of property taxes, it would need to be a constitutional amendment, because you're dealing with local assessors and things like that. There were some workarounds that we considered this legislative session, but again, with the whole COVID relief funds, we decided it wasn't the right time this year. But you might be able to do some kind of work with the tax commission to have some kind of statewide assessment for certain programs that qualify, maybe get DEQ involved to certify that they are a greenhouse gas reducing project that don't bring a positive return on investment. So DEQ would basically give it the head nod, yes or no, and then that would kick over to the Louisiana Tax Commission, who would then push it down to the impacted assessors as a discounted assessment. And we didn't believe that would require a constitutional amendment, but it would be a statutory change. Mm-hmm. To bring back that. Basically, we're wanting to resurrect the old, or no, I'm sorry. There is an existing property tax exemption buried in statute that I don't think it's ever been used, that we were looking to modify and make it usable is what we're looking at on this one.
Okay, thanks for that context.
Yep.
And what was the tax credit you mentioned on green industry jobs? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that was an existing, or I guess previous tax credit that was, I believe it came about in 2009 or 10, I believe, but it sunset in 2017. It was, I can't remember the exact function of that one, but it was basically, you could receive a credit up to and it was capped, and it had a pretty restrictive cap on it per project. It a tax credit that you could apply for, and there were some issues with how the I guess the program was administered and how that you could apply, and there wasn't a lot of certainty in it. So there's some definite tweaks that need to happen there, but it is an existing program that we could bring back and make some modifications to it to make it usable, because I don't believe it was ever used at the time. And I know also part of it was there wasn't quite this emphasis on green industries in Louisiana as now, but I think there were still some lingering concerns about, in particular, the I guess the certainty of that the fact that if you make this investment that you want to have a high degree of certainty that you can get the credit, and I don't think that was there under the credit program as it's currently written. So we need to look at how the cap is calculated and at how the I guess the timing of the application to credits versus when you're making your investments.
That makes sense. Thanks, Nathan, for raising that. I'm curious from our other members, Morris brought up a great point that there are barriers of decarbonization and implementing decarbonization projects. Are these ways that we've talked about sufficient to address those barriers, or are there other mechanisms or incentives that would be helpful to explore, to think about as we're exploring decarbonization through different mechanisms? Okay, great. If there are no other ideas on that, we can move forward now to this strategy with a lot of different actions underneath it on increasing deployment of carbon capture technology and infrastructure. Many of you had put forth actions here, so I'll pass it over to you guys to talk through the actions you put forward and how we can think about consolidating and what are the key messages and takeaways from these different actions in regard to carbon capture technology and infrastructure. Either Takesha or Graystream, if you guys could kick it off with your actions, that'd be great. Or Nathan, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll start because I kind of touched on it a second ago because I kind of jumped the gun. But really, I mean, Louisiana, and as I think we've said a million times, I sound like a broken record. I mean, we really have a unique opportunity here with CCUS, and we have a bit of I guess a bit of a leg up on even Texas in this space. I believe that they might be looking at doing primacy soon, but I know we're already pretty well down the track on that for Class 6 wells. So I think it's really it's on the state of Louisiana to kind of take this and run with it, really. And there's a couple of things that in our opinion that the state could be doing, and some of it's just continuing to do what they have been doing, but to really increase the adoption of CCUS in the state and really look at that as an area of strength for Louisiana, and also a way to grow our economy in a new creative direction and keep jobs in the state and to allow for some job growth. But some of the things we're looking at would be finding ways to help drive down the initial like pre-engineering development costs of sites. So maybe helping narrow down sites for investors who are looking to develop something, and you can look into that. You know, I know LSU Center for Energy Studies has done some work in that space, and that kind of leads me to my next is looking for opportunities to develop technology and pilot projects and leveraging DOE grants, which I believe that's where LSU has been getting some of their funding to do some of their pre-site screening studies that they've been doing that have been helpful. And then also, as I alluded to earlier, is continuing to work through remaining regulatory and statutory roadblocks. I know there's still some questions around, I guess, some long-term liability issues and some, I guess, landowner type rights things, and also just when you get down to the permitting, these are pretty lengthy permits from what I understand. So if there's ways to streamline that as much as possible, or get everybody on the same page with what the expectations are there, that would be very helpful. And I have to commend our friends over at DNR for the work that they have been doing on this. I know they have their ad hoc committees that they've been working through a lot of these challenges. I just would say let's keep up the good work there and continue those conversations. So really, that's really kind of in summary what we see as ways that the state can be increasing the adoption of CCUS and looking at it as a way for economic growth.
This
Thanks,
is Fred, and
Nathan.
I'll just say Nathan said it well, so ditto.
I was going to ask if other members have additional next steps or points to add on to the 3 things that Nathan framed really well for us. Takesha or Gray Stream, do you guys have any additions in your actions building on that?
No, I mean, I feel like Lamoga definitely has taken the lead on this statewide, and I feel like Nathan definitely knows more than probably most of the folks on this call when it comes to CCS. I just will reiterate what Nathan said about needing whether it be state or federal investment to make this a more attractive option. Like, we know that the potential is out there, the potential is really great, but that the infrastructure is just not in place yet. So if you really want to take full advantage of this really this strategy with so much potential, it would require some investment on the front end. So I agree with Nathan completely, and just want to reiterate emphasize that part.
Thanks, Takesha.
Well, since I'm sort of another ditto on some of those comments, I don't know if it's that helpful for me to pipe up, but I will. I appreciate the question. It looks like the way I wrote mine is shamelessly self-serving since I'm involved in that project. But it is about, hub development in our state. It is truly an opportunity. I'll say, I think, I'm not unique on this committee of industry and manufacturing in that I am not a member of industry or manufacturing per se. So I don't really represent industry, and there are folks on this call who do so effectively, but I am our background is more in land stewardship and natural resource stewardship and wetlands restoration projects. And, but I am a Louisiana guy. And as is noted, there's a reason that we have the carbon intensity that we do. And that's because, we are a critical hub for the entire country that relies on us to create the building blocks for so much of the economy. And as as Morris stated, we are in the state of Louisiana's industry and manufacturing cohort competes globally. And while the United States is bringing down its carbon emissions, it only represents 15% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and the other 85% is growing. And so we're fighting an uphill battle and really trying to put it on our shoulders. And already as we look back and just at our state, we're setting a really high bar for ourselves in an area that it is difficult to decarbonize. Again, not myself an industry guy, but very interested in trying to both achieve these goals and candidly not destroy the state's economy. So because when for instance, China is putting on more coal-fired power than the rest of the world combined, and doing it year after year and already double our greenhouse gas emissions and enjoying kind of that low cost of being able to manufacture, you know, our industry in the state of Louisiana that's trying to both be competitive in that global environment and help the U.S. achieve its goals of being environmentally responsible is really taking on a heck of a task. And I think when it comes to decarbonization, there are a lot of ways we can approach it, and it's got to get sliced. I mean, you know, what's for power is not necessarily for industry and manufacturing. There's a lot of crossover. What's for transportation and housing and other policy may not apply always. But if we don't work to support, you know, helping industry decarbonize, I really do think it will be really dire consequences for the state economy. And those greenhouse gases, the 85% that are happening elsewhere in the world and growing more rapidly than we're decreasing them in the US, are going to keep doing so for a while. So to land the plane on that with CCS, I would just say that what really transitioned us from just focused on kind of the nature-based with wetlands and forestry practices is, you know, it's the volume of work out there that shows its effectiveness, particularly as it relates to helping industry and manufacturing in these difficult to decarbonize areas. And the work of folks like Obama's Energy Secretary, Ernie Moniz, and Julio Friedman from Columbia and the Bureau of Economic Geology and so many others, you know, continues to point to the criticality of utilizing CCS as a component of the overall decarb strategy. And I guess I'm taking a few minutes on that because I know in some areas there seems to be some skepticism around it. And places like Europe are wholeheartedly embracing it and developing, you know, hubs in the North Sea that, you know, candidly, although they're being called global scale hubs, aren't even as big as the projects that we're developing here in Louisiana and have the ability to continue to expand, which is pretty impressive and exciting in terms of, I think, what it enables us to do in terms of continuing to support creating the building blocks of our economy here in the state, while also being in a position through CCS, as well as these other approaches. But CCS is unique. And I think that we're very fortunate to have a lot of those geologic and other you know, benefits. I will say that it's not just about poking a hole in the ground. The Class 6 process is very extensive and very difficult and time consuming, as has been mentioned. I would love to see that, I guess, streamlined, to use a word, but I caution that, you know, we're at a stage where we have to continue to create the body of evidence to show, you know, how compelling this solution is from a permanence standpoint in a way that, you know, it's hard to replicate in other ways, you know, from a safety standpoint. And so that those that may not fully understand it, and that may be where some of their skepticism comes from, can fully understand it and be a part of that conversation, and that there's transparency around it, because it is being embraced elsewhere. And Louisiana, I just commend some of the earlier comments that were made, and I commend the efforts of the state to you know, embrace it and continue to move it forward. So even more than just streamlining, consistency and predictability and good communication around the important and the critical components that that help all concerned know how you know, A, effective it is, and B, how safe it is. And again, there, you know, not all opportunities are created equal, but we do have some really compelling characteristics in our state, both from the human capital standpoint that understands our geology, And most importantly, some of the rock itself is really tier 1 and has a potential that not every geologic formation in the world has to be really, to be a really critically important solution and cost effective relative to, other means of trying to decarbonize. So I guess I got a little bit big picture there about just kind of a topic that maybe I'm preaching to the choir on some of it, but I think there's a lot of work out there that we, we're developing our own work here in the state, but there's a lot out there, be it, there's a lot of resources that we can continue to bring into the state to, to continue to educate. And again, like Nathan said, I commend what DNR is trying to do to create, structure, predictability, diligence, and a thorough, clear process. Again, I'm all for that being efficient and streamlined. I would also just say that there's an audience out there that needs to know that it's done right, and the fact is that we are in a place that it can be done right, monitored to show and ensure its permanence, safety, and effectiveness. So.
Thanks, Gray, for providing the big picture, but also bringing in some of the nuance to that as well. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about Project Minerva, one of the projects that you guys have done that you reference here. I know Tim was talking about the need for case studies earlier, and it'd be great to hear if that's a case study for us.
Sure. The concept there was to get to work. We started work on it in 2016, basically compiling and evaluating large regional seismic studies, and have worked with various groups from around the country on validating a very large kind of regional geologic formation. We've evaluated several, and I would say that I wouldn't discount a lot of the formations that are being identified as potentially promising for CCS, but it was important to us that we only focus on those that were really differentiated in terms of their characteristics. Louisiana does have, I think, ample geology, and part of what we're trying to do with Minerva is, for all the, and I don't say this in a disparaging way, but for all the talk out there, because of all those uncertainties and costs and risk that has to be taken with capital, and a need to continue to work with regulators to get that degree of clarity and assurance along the way, there wasn't exactly a rush to kind of go through that brain damage. But the thought was that we could use this project to do that. And I would commend, another project up in Illinois, which is the Archer-Daniels Midland project up there that was done with the DOE, that has been operational for quite a while now. But, the opportunity to help put a real project in place to prove Louisiana's geologic, capability, we have fully embraced all of the rigor and brain damage. Well, I say this, you can believe me or not, but sometimes the brain damage is a little bit much, but we've really embraced the rigor and diligence that the EPA has imposed on us, because it's important that we're creating I think a standard that is kind of beyond reproach. So it's a work in progress, but the idea is that, currently the permit for the first phase is for 2.7 million tons a year, which is a very large project. But that in and of itself has, I would say, significant expansion capability that can really make a big impact towards the state achieving its goals, of decarbonizing, especially hard to decarbonize industry in the region. And I think others will start to move forward with their projects as well. It's going to take a little while, but it's not going to take, decades, and it's known technology. It's really a process of validating geology and just going through the rigor to try to just going through that rigor essentially. So that's a little bit about, I guess, Minerva. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for walking us through that. Members, I'm curious if there's any other additions on this component of CCUS. And Gray's comments segue really well into that next component of transparency, feasibility, integrity, and environmental justice. Do we have any comments on this slide? So I know Scott is not here today to talk through his policy on environmental justice incorporated throughout this CCS process. Hunter, I was curious if you could talk through that first, the policy you put forward on pore space acquisition for us and lay out what that looks like.
Sure. Well, it sort of follows on Gray's comments about the importance of the permitting process with respect to CCUS projects, and the location of these projects, of course, could either be on private land or it could be on public lands. As it turns out, the state of Louisiana is in control of a lot of pore space by virtue of its ownership or control of lands that are, of course, the water bottoms and various state lands that exist in wildlife refuges and other places in the state. And currently, there's not really a stated policy for pore space acquisition. There is, of course, in connection with mineral exploitation, but there's not for the purpose of storage of CO2 in connection with sequestration of CO2. So the idea is really kind of simple. There's a lot to it, but basically the idea would be that there would be a policy that's promulgated by the Louisiana state government that would allow project developers who are interested in utilizing public, pore space that's owned by the public for carbon sequestration projects. And within that are elements of, for instance, what the pricing would be for acquisition of pore space, and how the state government would treat various projects relative to the amount of CO2 involved, and also competition between projects, since there's a lot of geophysical principles involved with this, including pressures, from CO2 perhaps injected close by, and also, of course, resolution of legacy issues like legacy oil and gas development, wells that have not been properly cased or abandoned, and other issues like that. So the idea, though, is simple, that there should be a public policy adopted by the state government to manage these issues.
Thanks, Hunter, for raising that idea and some really comprehensive policy ideas that we can think through behind that. And I think that's a great point to raise to DNR and to our DEQ partners in this process. Since we don't have them on the call today, I can follow up with you afterwards as we begin to think through that process as well, because that is really helpful. I'm curious from other members, I know we might not have the right experts in the room to dig into the details, but as we're thinking about transparency, feasibility, integrity, and environmental justice components, are we missing any key ideas, any actions that are really highlighted for you or that you find really interesting as we're thinking about these components of CCS? Or any points or key messages to convey here? If there are no further questions or ideas on this strategy, then our last set of strategies, just focusing on where electrification is not practicable, how can we increase the use of blue or green hydrogen, other derivative products and alternative fuels. And then on the other side, and we talked through this a little bit at the beginning of the meeting, but spurring emission reduction through ideas around the circular economy. So I'm curious, Morris, if you could talk us through this. I know that CF Industries, even aside from this action, has been pursuing development around green hydrogen, and that's a great area that we can think through as we're looking towards some technologies in the future, and how can we begin to build that out now to ensure that that is accessible in the future. If you or any other members have ideas around that, Eric Smith put forward, a member of our science advisory group, put forward a really specific action here on the processes that are involved in that, and then looking at other alternative fuels. One of our transportation committee members offered an idea around the use of renewable natural gas, possibly a renewable gas standard or a low carbon fuel standard. So that's a little more focused on transportation, but just wanted to bring that in front of you guys on alternative fuels. But as we're thinking through hydrogen specifically in manufacturing and industry, members, if you have any additional ideas or thoughts around incentivizing development of this, or the circular economy as well.
Yeah, this is Morris. I'll just touch on it a little bit, if I may. So on the hydrogen front, I think it's, you know, if you look at hydrogen and you see how it fits into, you know, the move toward a clean energy economy, hydrogen produced without carbon emissions is a critical component of that. The challenge, of course, is that the current technology, the gray technology that exists today, primarily with natural gas, as we move toward blue alternatives that we've spent quite a bit of time talking about already, that has its challenges and costs and relies heavily on carbon sequestration. And then ultimately on the green front, which I think you've mentioned several times, that, you know, the electrolyzers, the water electrolysis, that is the technology today is extremely capital intensive, very expensive, and relies on tremendous amounts of power. And of course, generally to qualify as green, much of that, if not all of that power, has to be renewable. Which brings us kind of full circle back to the state and the electrical grid and the availability of renewable. So, you know, I think it all kind of dovetails in well with what we've been talking about, that, you know, we've kind of touched on all the challenges on how we get from where we are today to where we get to green. And, you know, anything that And again, as many members have said, compliment the DNR on all the things that they're working on to try to make this happen, and continue to make industries that are energy intensive in Louisiana competitive going forward, not just in the next 5 years, but in the next 20 or 25 years.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Morris. Any additional comments on exploring green hydrogen or other alternative fuels here?
Lindsay, it's Fred. I'll just add that, and you may be well aware, but we've been working with some of your state colleagues, and I know with the intergovernmental task force that will kick off later this month around offshore wind potential in the Gulf of Mexico. There's also some body of work thinking, longer term, bigger picture beyond just the wind energy potential that has hydrogen as a component of that as well. And I know that Harry is working towards the Louisiana Wind Week virtual conference shortly after the Intergovernmental Task Force meets on the 15th. And I believe there will be some panels that will touch on hydrogen as part of that.
Absolutely, Fred. We've been working a lot with BOEM on pursuing offshore wind, and you're right, alongside green hydrogen technology as well. We're really excited to launch that, and we'll be keeping you guys up to date with the different sessions that we'll have throughout that whole wind week. So thanks for reminding me of that too. Well, this has been a great discussion on our strategies and actions. Members, I'm curious, and we don't need to take our full time today, but if there are any other overarching gaps or anything else that you see missing from the conversation today around our actions, or just any other key messages, I'll just open the floor now and pass it back over to our chair, Tim, if you want to close us out in any remarks. Oh, Tim, you're on mute.
I apologize. Lindsay, I just want to thank you for your overview and how you conducted the meeting. This has been very informative, quite robust, and it just demonstrates, I think, the commitment and the level of expertise we have on our committee. I'm very excited about it. I guess going forward, Lindsay, I'd like to hear what you have to say, but I think we can take a lot from what we have today and kind of consolidate some of our action items, look at them a bit more closely, and maybe differentiate what we need to institute over the short term, because we do have a 2030 deadline as opposed to a 2050, how those work best, and give some thought to those areas where we did have a few more questions and we have a chance to investigate those. But I've got to say personally, I learned a lot, and I've been sensitized about a lot of issues just in today's meeting. And I'd like to know if there are any other comments about today's meeting, since we do have a little time left. Well, let me just say thank you all. And Lindsay, I'll turn it back over to you for, I guess, next steps before we open it up for public comment.
Certainly, just one slide on our next steps. As I mentioned, our next meeting as a committee will be in mid-September, after the advisory groups do that next round of evaluation, and after our planning team and the governor's office has some time to work through priorities and through strategies and actions more. So it will be a more comprehensive picture of emission reduction in this sector when we meet again in September. So I would just say homework is engaging with the task force in their upcoming meetings. They're going to be meeting a few times this summer, working through some of these high-level priorities and getting to see the actions more in their raw form as they are now. And we'll continue, as I mentioned, to work with you all in further developing out these actions and on consolidating some of these ideas and beginning to build out some implementation pathways. So just be on the lookout for any updates from our team or any questions as we move forward with a lot of discussion today. We'll follow up with the presentation and on some notes from this meeting, but really appreciate the robust conversation that we've had around reducing emissions in this sector. It's been really helpful just to have this conversation and to think through all of these ideas in one place. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I see that we have a good amount of participants on our call today. And so if there are any participants who would like to make a public comment, if you raise your hand, I would be glad to admit you into our webinar and you can speak your comment. I'll also check our climate at la.gov, our climate@la.gov email to see if we have any written comments. Jane Patton, I see that you have a hand raised. I'm going to promote you to a panelist so that you can speak.
Sorry, that was an unusual little refresh. Can you hear me?
Yes. Great to have you, Jane.
Great to be here. Thank you. Dear committee, I want to applaud the work of this committee and the public who came together to put forward so many amazing proposals for action on climate in Louisiana. I remain concerned about some false solutions that have snuck their way among some truly great projects. For instance, discussions of burning waste for energy is not actually quote unquote recycling, and it's wildly inefficient, carbon intensive, and polluting. Whether recycling will serve us is not a matter of belief. It's that all attempts to build up enough recycling of materials like plastics have fallen far, far short of what is needed to prevent pollution and to protect the climate. Another false solution that has made its way into this list of actions is carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is a distraction from the pathway as outlined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that has the best chance of keeping warming low enough to keep Louisiana's people alive. Carbon capture is expensive, energy intensive, and unproven at scale. Carbon pipelines are expensive, energy intensive, and extremely dangerous when placed near residential areas, as y'all's plans seem to want to do. Carbon sequestration and use technologies are largely still theoretical, and they are so expensive as to be prohibitive for even the largest of corporations and industries. These ideas seem nice to talk about, but they are not real solutions. You have heard real solutions suggested by the members of the Gulf South for a Green New Deal. We are not here to beg. We are here gathered together to demand that you prioritize transitioning to truly renewable energy and to maximizing efficiency, that you prioritize public safety, justice, and equity for everyone in the ways that climate-safe policies are implemented, and that you recommend actions and policies to the governor and the legislature that reduce pollution, reuse existing resources, and create jobs that are permanent, safe, and regenerative. It's what we all deserve, including members of this task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for raising that public comment. Are there any other attendees in our webinar that would like to make a comment? I see a comment from Jennifer Mouton in the chat box, and her comment reads, I think it would be helpful to the process if during the portfolio building exercise, each action proposal could be characterized as highly effective or highly desirable to less effective and less desirable as a scaling technique. Although every one of us should contribute to greenhouse gas reductions, certain actions will likely lead to greater reductions than others. Knowing which ones are most promising would help focus resources and efforts on those. Thanks, Jennifer, for raising that comment. And I see your hand raised. I'm going to promote you to a panelist so that you can join us in the webinar. Jennifer, you should be able to unmute and state your comment.
Okay, I got it. Sorry. Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, I was just, as I was listening to all of the very good ideas that you guys have come up with, I couldn't help but think and wonder, like, well, you know, would some of these maybe be more doable, more effective than others? And I know that you guys are going to be later on kind of creating portfolios with all of these various measures in them. And so I know sometimes when we're looking at alternatives, it's helpful to know which ones are like highly effective and which ones maybe we would desire but might not be as effective. It kind of helps kind of, like you said, scale it. So I was hoping, I know right now there's not any emphasis on any particular one, but I was hoping that as you produce these, you know, various solutions, that they can kind of be categorized as like, this one's going to be, it's effective, it's doable, it's likely going to get us far down the road with, you know, towards our goal, versus ones that may not get you as far, or maybe some that you might want to do during the second part of like the 2050 goal or the 2030 goal, as opposed to the initial goal. So maybe, you know, kind of like prioritizing them maybe, or, you know, scheduling, looking at them out over the entire period of time. You can kind of like prioritize which ones will be, you know, doable now versus which ones may come to be available later. I think it'd be really helpful. So that was just my comment. But they're all really wonderful ideas. I love them. They look great. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that comment. So we'll be, just one quick thought on that, we will be using this tool called the Energy Policy Simulator that's helping us understand emission reduction potential of our different actions scaled down, specifically for Louisiana, actually, an open source tool. We'll be talking through that at the task force meeting next week some, but that will help bring a little bit more granularity to what is most effective or least effective at reducing emissions. So I appreciate you raising that as a comment. Is there anyone else with comments from our attendee list? I'll check our climate email one more time. Seeing none, I will pass it back over. Oh, I do see one more comment from Kim Goodell. Kim, you should be joining us in the webinar.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is more a question about the pilot project that Gray Stream spoke of, the Project Minerva. I'd like to know where I can get more information about it, and just from a general standpoint, what kind of geologic feature is he using for that project? And is he looking more towards long-term permanent sequestration, or is it more use on a short-term basis where he has an end use for what it is that he's sequestering? And that's it. It's a question for Gray.
Thanks, Kim. I'll pass that over to Gray if he's still on our call, and if not, I can follow up with you both over email.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
I'm on the call, and although I'd say it's not a pilot project, just to clarify that, but it is intended for permanent sequestration. There's no reuse.
Okay. And you said it was in Southwest Louisiana. Is it a like a depleted reservoir, or is it a salt dome? Is it a what is the feature that's being used?
Deep saline.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no more comments, I'll pass it back over to you, Tim.
Lindsay, thank you very much. Again, this was extremely informative, clear indication of a lot of homework, very robust and very informative. I want to thank you all. Thank members of the public that joined us today. There are no further comments. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Stream.
I second.
There's a second by, who was that?
Keisha.
Oh, Takesha. For our record, if there are no objections, meeting stands adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.